Ok, buenas tardes, otra vez, es un gusto estar acá. Después de 3 años de no haber seminarios presenciales, tenemos hoy con nosotros al artista Reed, que viene del Banco Mundial, terminó su doctorado en Harvard en Economía, también trabajó en el sector privado, en McKinsey, y pues actualmente está trabajando en la División de Investigación Económica del Banco Mundial. Y nos va a platicar hoy sobre una investigación que está haciendo sobre Antitrust en México. Pues te quiero, güey.
Gracias.
Las preguntas van a ser online.
Okay.
Online no, en
Yeah.
As we go.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. This? Shall I hold it? Okay. Like this. Okay, great. So thank you so much. I'll speak in English, but if you want to ask questions in Spanish, I'll try. Yeah, and this is the first time I've presented this to an academic audience, so I'm really excited. And this audience in Mexico is the ideal audience because of this topic here. So just to give you an outline of the talk, I'll start with the motivation and talk about the institution, so the Federal Competition Commission of Mexico, which is now called COFECE, the Federal Economic Competition Commission. Then I'll talk about the data. And then, a lot of this is about identification. How do we identify the effects of COFECE's actions? And it's complicated. So I'm going to divide that into 2 parts. First, I'll tell you about the outcomes of investigations. So just, what happens after investigations and resolutions. And then we'll talk about the identification of the causal effects of COFECE and its actions. Then we'll talk about the results and some conclusions for policy. I should also say that this is my research with my colleagues at the World Bank, and they're not views of the directors of the World Bank. And we'll I think publish this as a working paper quite soon. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback. So to start, and this is a very United States-focused view, but there's now a much stronger consensus than before among economists and lawyers that antitrust and competition law enforcement is very important in the economy. So I've cited, a number of people here, both lawyers and economists, and I think everyone agrees, that it's important. But we don't have a lot of systematic evidence on the effects of antitrust enforcement. And especially outside of the United States and the European Union. There's one very nice paper recently in the AER Insights where they just look across countries and say, countries that have more scope for antitrust law. In those countries, the non-tradable sector has lower profits, okay? And the idea there is that, global trade will discipline competition in the tradable sector, but in the non-tradable sector, that's where you may need extra regulatory enforcement. And then, I should say also that, there are case studies in Mexico in particular on certain sectors, like banking and telecommunications. In this paper, what we're going to do is look at a large sample of cases, investigations, and then decisions whether to sanction by COFECE. I'll call it the commission because the name has changed, and in our data, most of it is the first one, the Competition Commission. Whereas banking and telecom have kind of very specific characteristics and specific histories, here we'll look across a number of other industries in mainly commerce and manufacturing. Okay, and please just interrupt if you have questions. I mean, it's an economics seminar. You can't just let me talk. Okay, so just to begin, I really like starting. So what's the basis of competition law in Mexico? Well, there's this very strong article in the Constitution that says, there shall be no monopolies, except, of course, where the state controls things. But, it's still very strong. And the law shall punish severamente. So this is very strong language. the concentration or cornering in a few hands of articles of prime necessity for the purposes of obtaining a rise in prices. And if you contrast this with the US Sherman Act, which comes a bit earlier and is, I think widely recognized as the first major anti-competition law in the world, I think the Mexican Constitution is a bit stronger. It says, there shall be no monopolies. In the United States, it's a felony if you attempt to monopolize, but if you're already a monopoly, that's okay. And then, there's also, there isn't this phrase about punishing severely. So I think, Mexico from, even at this very early point in 1917 has very strong competition laws. Now, however, Mexico did not create an independent agency to enforce this law until fairly recently. So until 1993, this part of the Constitution was, implemented mostly by the presidency. It was used to impose, and this is, what people have told me. You can tell me more, but impose price controls and control production during World War II, for example. But then in 1993, this Competition Commission is created. It's a separate agency with its own regulations, its own commissioners, and I'll get into this, but and I think that the point of this is just that the US has its Federal Trade Commission in 1914, the Europeans start in 1958. So by studying Mexico, we learn about how you can, basically what can be the impact of a competition agency when it's relatively new. So, and I think, what's interesting here as well is that, when they established it, they borrowed a lot from the experience of the FTC and other agencies. So it's kind of an example of saying, okay, if you start a new agency following best practices, what can you achieve in 30 years? And so from this, I work at the World Bank. There are many countries in Latin America and other places that have less experience than Mexico. So I hope this is an example of what countries can do when starting relatively fresh. So I should note this was part of the Salinas de Gortari administration. I know that's controversial, but you can think of that reform period as saying, we're going to look at the tradable sectors. We'll increase competition through NAFTA and the World Trade Organization. But then the Commission is really going to be responsible for the non-tradable part of the economy. So it has a very important role there. And then crucially, as I said, it's also taking the enforcement away from the presidency. So it's an independent institution. And then, in 2002, the OECD has this peer review. And they say, well, Mexico's competition regime is equipped with strong powers, solid institutions, and enforcement tools. And so it's actually ranked very highly, next to Denmark and New Zealand and many other countries. So it's achieved a lot, and I think that's been recognized internationally. But we don't have evidence on its impacts, which is what this paper is about. So let me just tell you a bit about how COFECE works. So I'll just say one thing too. So it has two roles. One is investigating illegal monopolistic practices, so that it's like a police, detective. They investigate and then they try them. It also does merger review. So when firms merge, they have to announce if it's above a certain size, and then they do a study. I'm not going to talk about that now. So that's a kind of separate issue that I'd like to get at in future research. But so the agency can start an investigation. That can come from two sources. One is that it can start what they call ex officio. So they choose which industries are important and investigate them. There is also a mechanism whereby members of the public can complain. And often this is that, someone is in a cartel and then they want to offer a lower price, and then they complain about everybody else. I'll give you an example. So what happens is they receive these complaints, and then they do a preliminary investigation, and that can go one of two ways. So one is that they can say, okay, well, somebody complained, but it doesn't look like there's a crime there, or the people won't provide us with additional evidence. And in those cases, the case is dismissed or it's not presented, so they just don't investigate it. However, if they do find that a crime may have been committed, they will do an investigation and they'll try to get evidence of whether something illegal has happened. And then there are two outcomes. So one is that they do the investigation and they say, we don't actually have enough evidence to convict, and so then the case will be closed, and I'm sorry. The case will be closed. However, if they do have evidence, they will start this trial procedure. So the investigation agency is separate from the actual commission. So when they decide there's enough evidence, they'll then start this trial in which the commission will investigate the commission will consider the evidence and then make a decision about whether there should be a sanction or not. So the outcome in this resolution is most of the time a sanction, so a financial fine for the agents involved. And when we talk about identification, one thing that is very interesting about Mexico is that they announce the relevant markets of all the investigations. So we're able to look at markets where the cases are closed and markets where there are sanctions. And that comparison is going to be very important for the identification strategy. And I also want to say that's not possible in the United States. So in the United States, they only announce which market is being investigated when it goes to the trial procedure. So almost all of the announcements end in sanctions because they don't, they only want to announce it if they know they're going to win. Whereas in Mexico, they announce any investigation that begins, and then we can see what happens in both industries. So that'll be key, and I'll bring you along to that. Okay. So what are our data? So we have from the commission, and this is all public on the website, right? All of the investigations that they've undertaken since 1993. In antitrust investigations, the first step is to define what's called a relevant market. So that is the products that are close substitutes for the same consumer, and that defines the market in which the agents are competing, right? So you have to define that at some level. COFECE reported to us a 4-digit NICE classification. We then go through and read all of the documents, and my co-author, Ana Urrutia, did this, and we match them sort of even more specifically to a 6-digit classification. The reason why I say 4 to 6 is because we're going to look at the census, back to 1993 to 2000, and so you have to have a consistent grouping of products, and so it's a bit bigger than the 6-digit now. They become more expansive as you go back. And then most cases are national, so it would be like, the national market for refrescos. But in some cases, the relevant market is defined as just a municipality or a state. So in that case, we'll define the 6-digit classification, and then we'll look just in that state or municipality. So that's the data on the commission. Then we use the economic census, which is incredible data, and it's again available to the public. So this is every 5 years from 1993 to 2018. These are the calendar years that are covered. So they'll say it was the 1994 census, but it's the data from 1993. This covers all non-agricultural establishments. So it was described to me that if you have a roof, you're in the census, okay? COFECE does do a few cases that are in agricultural markets, so we miss those. But and this is something we're working on, but this also includes the informal sector, so small firms and people that aren't paying the Social Security as well. So what we do is for each relevant market, we'll construct an aggregate measure. So each 5 years we'll know in this market what are sales, what is the wage rate, what are profit margins. And most investigations and resolutions, so the start of the investigation and then I'll show you different moments from the distribution. So we take the mean, we can look at the 10th percentile, whatever. I'll show you all of that. And the way I calculate margin is just value added minus, output minus intermediate minus wages. So I don't include financial costs because it's kind of standard because they'll vary a lot across industries. So it's operating margin. Yes, okay, so, and most investigations and resolutions take place in 2 years. So actually, again, relative to the United States, COFECE is pretty fast how they deliberate. And so most of the time, the cases will happen between a census time. So it's kind of a clean break in the time series. And when they happen between multiple years, I'll control for that and I'll show that it doesn't really affect the results. Okay, so just to give you a sense, what I did here is this is the 2018 census, and I've just coded every NICE code equal to 1, and it's red if there's ever been one investigation. So going back, and then this is the total sales. And so you can see that actually like 40% of the economy has been investigated at some point in time. And you can see that commerce and transport, which is a classic non-tradable, has been investigated more than manufacturing, which is exposed to trade. So this is a little bit of evidence that they've specialized in the non-tradable sector, though not entirely. And then, construction and mining, services. Agriculture is a 0 here because it's not in the census. So but it's like 3% of GDP. So you can, you don't need to worry about it. Okay. So I want to talk first about measuring outcomes of investigations. So I'm going to measure the outcomes after each investigation, and I'm going to do it for different variables, but let's just talk about sales for now. Okay, so total sales in the industry. I want to look at how that changes relative to changes in outcomes in other markets in the same subsector. So, and we'll do this in a difference in differences framework. So the treated market is going to be the market that there was an investigation. And then the control market will be in the same anything in the same 3-digit code. And the idea there is that, I'll give you some examples, but the idea is that, because it's a similar product, they'll have similar trends in demand and costs. Maybe, but there's a caveat, right? So now, people write papers about difference in differences. It's a way to identify treatment effects. And it seems that some of the requirements for that strategy are actually satisfied here. So, the investigation and resolution in this 5-year panel are unanticipated news, right? People don't know, there's so many markets, you can't know which one COFECE is going to pick. And because many times they do an investigation and they don't sanction companies, it's also hard to predict, what the outcome will be. And so you can think of this as kind of an unexpected shock to the industry and see what will happen. But there's a problem with that, which is that the investigations are not random, right? The investigations specifically look at industries where illegal practices are expected. Literally, people report that, there is an illegal practice going on, and then they investigate it. So you can't assume in this difference in difference that the treatment is random, like that the treatment and the control markets are the same, even though they're in the same sector, right? So So for this reason, I'm going to call the difference in difference a change in outcomes rather than a causal effect. Okay? So let me just give you some examples of this. So this is a paper from 1993, so the year COFECE was founded, in the Journal of Political Economy. Sproul looks at, he does a difference in difference. It is not called that at the time. After announcements of Justice Department indictments for price fixing. And he says, what happens to the prices? So the paper is called Antitrust and Prices. He compares similar goods, just as I do. So for example, there's a cartel in potasa, yes? Fertilizer. And so he compares that to potasio. Okay, gracias. Should not try to speak Spanish, maybe I, but and he compares that to nitrogen fertilizer. And then what he finds is that actually often prices go up after the Justice Department indictment. And there's a very, kind of radical conclusion. He says, well, the Justice Department is wrong. They're punishing efficient conspiracies. And, if the Justice Department hadn't intervened, the prices maybe wouldn't have gone up. Now, this was published in 1993. I think there's a problem with this, which is that the Justice Department only announces an indictment when it's pretty sure something is happening in the industry. So it's not surprising that you see the prices going up because there could be something happening there. And then, so I claim that he doesn't actually have the right counterfactual. If, maybe the prices of potassium are going up, but maybe they would have gone up even more without the indictment, right? And so in this sense, potassium and nitrogen are different. They're like selected. The potassium is selected because it was selected by the investigation. So that's what, we're going to deal with. Now, I'm not done talking about the outcomes. So now I do this in Mexico, and I'm going to estimate these difference in differences. So for each case, excuse me.
This is a very simple question, but
yeah.
Are you controlling for inputs in the change in prices?
So his claim is just that he selects only one control, and that's similar enough. So and when he selects them, he does say they have similar inputs, but there's no formal controlling. It's literally just these lines in the paper. So yeah, go ahead.
Is there any type of concern that your control sector, like your control group, is going to react to the indictment?
Yeah. Yes. So this is very important. So the control groups are specifically defined so that they're not in the relevant market. Okay. So in the refrescos example, we're going to compare refrescos to like cigarettes, tequila. So they're in the same group, but they don't kind of compete directly. So I think, from that perspective, there shouldn't be a competitive effect. Now, you could say that maybe there's a deterrent that, but what I claim in the difference in differences, at least that would bias the effects downward. So it would make them closer to zero, because if the, say sales, goes up in refrescos and then also in tequila, the difference will be small. So I can't say that, but I would say it would sort of go against finding significant effects. But yeah.
And do you do anything to check the assumptions?
Yes. Let me describe that to you right now. So for each case, each investigation, I'm going to estimate this theta j, which is a different difference in difference treatment effect relative to the specific control group I've selected. And I'm going to use this new approach called the synthetic difference in differences by these four authors. So Imbens just won the Nobel Prize in economics, and Athey is actually at the Justice Department now doing. So I sent this paper to her, and she said, difference in differences and antitrust is my two favorite things. So. But I really love this methodology, and so I think just, I'm happy to teach you about it as well, because it has a lot of advantages relative to other approaches. So,
Athey is now in the Department of Justice?
Yeah, she's an advisor to them. I mean, she's not like moved, but she's, yeah. So, because they're regulating tech, right? Okay. So what do we do? So for each market, I told you I'm going to select this set of controls from the same sector that were not treated. Then what the estimator does is it actually weights them so that they have the same parallel trend as the treatment group. So that's why the synthetic, but before the investigation. And what's really great about this is this approach has more statistical power than both synthetic controls and difference in difference. So synthetic controls is very similar, but it requires that the synthetic control have the same level as the treatment group. So it has to be fixed exactly. In the synthetic difference in differences, it says you can have a fixed difference between them. And that ends up meaning that one, you don't need as long a pre-period, which is important in this because I only have 6 years of the census. So it's better than the synthetic controls. They also, so for those of you that the synthetic control, the famous example was cigarette taxes in California. So what happens after you change? And they show that the synthetic difference in difference gives actually a little smaller treatment effect. So it ends up being slightly more conservative than this. It's also more powerful than the difference in difference, because the difference in difference assumes that all the controls are just weighted equally. Whereas here, you weight them similarly, and that means you have more statistical power. There's another thing I don't have here, but they also, this is like icing on the cake, is they weight the pre and post treatment periods differently to minimize the standard error of the difference, which helps with even more with statistical power. So I really read this paper. It'll solve, everything you've been wondering about difference and difference. So and you can represent this as a standard two-way fixed effect regression. These I's are the fixed effect for the industries. And I think, the important thing is that because I'm doing this kind of one case at a time, it's basically like I'm allowing for subsectors of 3-digit time trends that are different. So it's a kind of within sector comparison. And so that's how we estimate. And then, but what's going on in the background is this weighting that is sort of a different step. Yes?
Just about the method, you have also placebo tests and that stuff with this methodology as a difference, or it's not working?
Yeah, so the way to think about this is that it's enforcing the parallel trends assumption. So you don't need to test if there's parallel trend. I'm not sure what you mean by a placebo test.
Like, for example, putting some date in which the patient did not enter, see the effects still there, or something like that. Also implement that here?
Yes, so that's actually the way that you generate the standard errors. So you do a placebo test, and then it gives you kind of the variance of these. You assume that in the control group there's it's slightly different than what you're saying, though. I haven't done the specific placebo test you're asking for, but it is possible in this framework. The way you calculate the standard errors are you sort of assume there's a treatment in the controls, and then see what that effect implies, and then you use that to bound the variance of this guy. Yep.
Does this make any type of adjustment like the Goodman-Bacon, where you take into account the early
Great point.
switchers versus the
Great point, yes. So there's been a lot of literature on the staggered difference in difference. And at a high level, that's what we're doing, right? The COFESE treats different industries at different times. However, I'm getting around that by having this kind of one experiment per case. So in every case, I just have one treatment and then a set of controls that I picked from the thing. So there's no possible contamination. Yeah, and then I'll estimate, one for each case, and then I'm going to show you. I'm going to kind of regress those on other variables. Let me sort of hold this until we go a bit further. Okay, so that's the approach. Again, amazing paper. So this is, and you can make these great graphs. Okay, so this is the first case. So this is a case which was, and Alejandro, you know about this, which is. Yes, exactly. So we can discuss that, right? So this was in Lake Chapala in Jalisco State, is a resort town. I haven't been there, but and there are real estate brokers that were accused of fixing prices, and it was actually a member of their group that reported them because he wanted, and they had written rules, okay, to say, you need to charge this much commission and you need to share information. And so what we do is, so that's the blue line, so that's the log of sales by real estate brokers in Lake Chapala. And then this red line is the average of other real estate sectors. I'll show you them in a minute. In the national market. So we just take this control, and then you can see it selects these weights, so there's this very clear, pre-trend. And then, the way the difference in difference works is you say, well, what's the difference in the control? You move that up to the level of the treatment, and then this yellow line is the difference. So what this is saying here is that after the final decision, there was an increase in sales by real estate brokers in Lake Chapala, and so we're going to attribute that to the decision with the caveats that I've said. Now I want to make one comment, which is that this case actually took a long time. So it started, I think, in 2007, I believe, maybe 2004. It started earlier. So there is a little bit of a period where, this could have responded. But the synthetic control is also controlling for that a bit. So it's making sure that this is as tight a match as possible. So when I talk about, and I'll show you, that this ends up not mattering, but when I talk about the effects, it's kind of the effect of the final decision. And just for those interested in law, I guess there's this thing called the amparo, right, in Mexico, where you can ask for. Yeah, it's an appeal process and you get protection. But so that is used very heavily, and it often stymies the work of the commission. So it lasted for a very long time. But I think another one of these that's important is that this was a case that was very clear. There was a written record that said we're going to fix prices, and the law says that's illegal. And so I guess maybe you didn't agree, but so they were eventually fined. And it was 30 million pesos. So, and just to show you here, so this is how the weighting works. So these are the other industries I selected. So it's in the same 3-digit sector. It's basically rentals that happen without a broker. So if I'm renting a house or whatever, and then there's also this other services, which is like building management. And then these are the weights, that allowed it to match. So here's another example. So this is actually an example. So this line is green because this was a case where they did an investigation, but they decided not to sanction. And so this was in Guadalajara. There's these, I guess they're exhibitions about wedding supplies. So I don't know, you may be more familiar with this than I am, but there are these exhibitions. And there was a magazine called, I think, Novias magazine, Revista de Novias or something. And then there was another one called Expo Tu Boda. And it was alleged that Expo Tu Boda told people, if you want to present your dresses or your photos in our thing, you cannot participate in the Revista de Novias. And so this is an exclusive contract, right? Now, in the law, this is called Yeah, relativo. So unlike price fixing, the agents have the opportunity to say, well, you know, this maybe benefits people or it doesn't have a negative effect. In the case, when you read what they said is, well, they offered these exclusive contracts, but people didn't take them in the end. So, and they actually, there was one example where they say, you know, they offered this contract, but then I said, no, I won't even participate in Expo Tuboro because you're trying to stop me from working in the other one. So what's great is that in the census, there is actually a code for wedding dress retail. And so that's what we look at in the blue line. And then we compare it here. And so you can see that, you know, I had fewer periods, but it still matches pretty well, right? Whoops. It still matches pretty well. But here, the result is very different, right? So it seems to be going down. Now, one interpretation of that is to say, well, this was actually a very harmful practice, and because we allowed it to continue, you know, they kept just contracting the industry. Maybe. Another hypothesis is that, well, actually the population in Guadalajara is getting older, and there are fewer weddings. And so this is just a declining industry. And so that's one of the things where I said, you know, these could be selected. There could be something special about these industries. And so for that reason, I'm uncomfortable, you know, attributing all of this to the fact that they, you know, passed the commission, okay? And then here's an example, and I think this is like, for me, very convincing that this thing works, is it's where, okay, so you're comparing wedding dresses, and so it compares that 55% to sales of diapers. Okay, so people getting married and having children. And then hosiery and items used in sewing. I think haberdashery is in haberdashery in Spanish. I don't know. Hosiery and like threads and needles. Okay, so that's just saying, you know, that's what matched, and then, huh? Yeah. What did you say? That? Merceria. That's it. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. So, you know, I think this is just, you know, the fact that wedding dresses and baby diapers go together says that, you know, this is kind of, it is picking similar industries. And so here's a third one. So this is a national industry. This was a case against Coca-Cola. It was lobbied, you know, it took a long time, but actually eventually the Supreme Court reversed a decision of the commission. So they had sanctions, and then it was reversed. And, you know, here we don't see any difference. So, you know, in this case, it's just kind of a zero effect. And then here's the thing. So, yeah, it's like cigars, distilled agave beverages.
The date you're putting there is the date the commission ruled the case.
This is when it closed the case based on the Supreme Court. So there was a decision earlier. But I'm always going to talk about the final decision. So, yeah. Because if I looked at the earlier ones, then the treatment would be contaminated. Yeah, so, okay. Okay, so now I've given you a good sense of what happened, but as I said, I don't want to interpret these causally. Why? Because of the targeting. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to compare the outcome changes, this theta, in the cases that end in sanctions, so that's like the real estate example, with outcome changes after the cases that are closed, so the wedding supply example. And so what's that going to do? Is it going to tell us what is the effect of sanctions within the markets that are being investigated? So, and as I said, you know, this is not possible in the United States. It's only possible in Mexico because they announce all the markets and the investigations. So Sproul didn't have this thing. And so the way you can think about this is like as a triple difference. You know, you do the relative to the agency, but then we're going to see how they compare. And what's also useful about this is that just by looking at the outcome changes in the closed cases, we can see, well, what are the characteristics of the industries that are being targeted? So I just showed you sales, but we'll look at wages, we'll look at profits. So we can see, we can also, this is going to tell us something about the treatment effect of sanctions, but then also how the COFECE is targeting its investigations. What are the types of places it looks at? And there is a possible threat to identification here, which is that the sanctions themselves are endogenous, and I'll talk about that later. So let me just I'll get through this. And so I want to give you another example from the literature that I think builds intuition. So Cuoca has this incredible book on merger review in the United States. And his research question is, so what is the effect of conduct remedies? So this is where you say to the firm, okay, you're allowed to merge, but I'm going to restrict your business in certain ways to protect competition. So, there was an example when Ticketmaster and Live Nation merged in the United States. They said to Ticketmaster, you have to make your software available to a competitor under their own brand. So some competitor can use this. And so the question is, does this, we think mergers are going to raise prices. Does this stop that from happening? That's his research question. So he looks in the literature and he compiles all these difference in difference price changes after very large mergers. So the same thing I did, right? Like, before and after the merger, and then he has a control industry where there is no merger. And he finds, perhaps unsurprisingly, that after mergers, prices go up, okay? And, perhaps at the University of Chicago in the 80s, you would have learned that mergers make things more efficient, and so prices could go down. Empirically, that doesn't seem to be happening. Mergers raise prices. Then what he does is he says, well, if I want to know the effect of the conduct remedy, I have to compare the difference in difference effect in a merger where there was a conduct remedy to another merger that was just approved. And so the idea there is that the industries where there's a merger remedy are, they're special industries. They're going through a merger. And so the counterfactual is another industry going through a merger. And so in this study, right, my counterfactual industry, so when COFECE has a sanction, the counterfactual is not a normal industry. It's another industry that maybe has anti-competitive behavior going on. And so that's the idea we take from Cuoca. And so what he finds is that the conduct remedies don't do anything to prices. So you still see the same increases. And now actually based on this research, the DOJ and the FTC are saying we're not going to do conduct remedies anymore. We're just going to block mergers. I'll say one final thing. So in Cuoca's case, he's able to say, so he doesn't, because the Department of Justice doesn't announce every investigation. But what he says is that because I look only at the largest mergers, I'm sure that they were investigated. So he's kind of restricting the sample to just the biggest mergers. But again, in Mexico, I don't have to do that because I know all of the investigations. So we can look kind of, at smaller issues, okay?
So you would effectively be considering the treatment effect of an announcement to investigate.
The outcome change, yes, yes, yes.
When there's an investigation announced, but the case is closed to that of a sanction.
An investigation when there's a sanction, yeah. So it's a triple difference. And so I'll show you how I do this formally. So so Cuoca, there's this really vigorous criticism of his book by actually employees of the FTC. So Vida and Osinski are in the FTC, and it's scathing. But one of their big issues with him is that he doesn't account for the fact that the difference in differences are measured with statistical error. So each theta, has some standard error. So we're going to account for that in the way of the meta-analysis literature. So I run this regression where I take the difference in difference, there's 95 of them, And then I regress it on a constant, and then a dummy for whether there's a sanction or not. So this gamma 1, uh-oh. I don't know what happened. Okay, I still have that power, so. No, it's okay. The laser is not, but it's fine. So this gamma 1 is going to be the difference, just as you've described. And the way you implement this is basically so there's two error terms here. So the first is this epsilon, and that actually I take that and then whenever I estimate this difference in difference, I get a standard error, and then I just plug it in there. So it's kind of adding the statistical error. And then, whoops, sorry. Okay. And then I also have a random effect. So this is like, I think you learn about random effects, but I don't think economists use them very much. But in the meta-analysis literature, which is basically from medical sciences, this is very important. So you're just saying that in addition to the statistical error, there's actual heterogeneity in the treatment effect, right? So, and that's very natural here, right? Because industries are very different. You should expect, that they're different. And so I just have this extra term, which, has some variance, and I throw that in. The only thing that does is it just increases the standard errors a little bit. So it's conservative, but I think appropriate, for this setting, because we think industries are very different from one another. Okay, so here's the results. So I'm just regressing. The outcome is the difference in difference on the dummy and then a constant. So look at this first column. I shouldn't have shown all these. So look first at the constant. That is, what is the average difference in difference in an industry where there's no sanction, so in the closed cases, and that's negative. So that's saying when there's when there's an investigation but a closed case, we see a decline. So that's what I showed you in the wedding example. But when you have sanctions, that's almost entirely reversed. So there's a positive effective sanctions relative to this group. So what I interpret from that is that you're looking at industries where sales are declining, but then when you do the sanction, assuming it's exogenous, we'll get there in a second, that means that you're actually increasing sales. And so, Alejandro, you had really nice intuition for this, which if I may borrow, which was to say that one thing that might be going on is that actually cartels are more likely to emerge in industries that are declining. So, if your demand is falling for whatever reason, you say, okay, let's fix prices to protect our profits. And that I'm not saying that's what's going on, but that could explain, what we found here. So now I'm just going to show you a bunch of robustness tests. So this one,
Some cases you can find out bankruptcies before the cartel of bankruptcies in the same.
is there a database?
Pharmaceuticals in particular.
Okay. Yeah, this pharmaceutical case is an example. Yeah, so there's a quote which I actually need to find exactly where it is, but you said it, they said, if we don't cooperate, we'll exit or we'll die. Okay, so here I just have, a couple of controls. So the first is what I call a potential anticipation effect. So remember I told you that some of the investigations will start, before in the census. This is just a dummy for that. It doesn't seem to affect much. It's not significant and it doesn't change. And then this is another dummy for there are multiple cases in the same treated industry. So sometimes, again, because the census is, the industry groupings are not very fine because I have to go back all the time. You can have multiple cases in the same year in the same industry. And what's interesting about that is it says, well, that's negative and significant. And so it changes this. So this is actually saying that the industries where there are multiple cases and they're closed are doing even worse, which again makes sense, right? Like you have more investigations, the industry is even declining even more, but that control doesn't affect the effective sanctions. So the sanctions are still positive and increasing this. So in these columns, what I've done is I've just estimated the outcome change using a different methodology. So the first is what I call an event study. So there I throw away the control group entirely, and I just have a control for the time trend. So just the year times the thing. So it says it's not before and after, it's before and after minus some trend. And this is, from, the finance literature, the labor literature, like in the 90s. But it's just, and we find kind of very similar effects. So what that tells me is it's not this control groups that I have selected. Even when I throw them away, it doesn't matter. Here, for the local cases, I told you a subset, happened in just one municipality. Here, for those ones, I say, instead of controlling to different industries, comparing to different industries, I compare to the same industry in other localities. Doesn't seem to change much. Here I do the difference in difference, so that's just without the weighting. So just weight all the controls equally. Again, it's very similar. And here's the synthetic control. What's interesting is that this is the same result as in the Imbens paper, but that the effects are much bigger with the synthetic control. So it has kind of properties that may overestimate effects, at least relative to others. So, but overall, I want you to take from this that the fact is pretty robust to however you define the difference in differences. Okay, so sales are falling when there's closed cases. That's reversed when we have sanctions. Now let's look at workers. Okay, so here I have two outcomes. One is the wage, the other is employment. This is just calculated kind of in aggregate, so I take the total remuneration in the industry in a year, divide it by total employment. It's harder to do at the firm level because a lot of firms, don't have wages, right? The informal ones don't. What is this saying? It says, well, in industries where you close the case, wages are falling, and then that's actually reversed by the sanctions. And the same thing is going on with employment. It's not significant, but it's sort of the same direction. So you're losing employment, and that's reversed a bit. Finally, and here to get your question, Alejandro, this is the profit margin. So this is, and I do these in different ways. So this is the mean in the industry at a time. It's output minus intermediates minus wages divided by output. So it's a percentage. So this is saying that in the industries where you investigate but close the case is about 3% percentage point higher profit margin. It's significant, and it seems to go down. It's not significant, as before. And then I thought this was very interesting. So here we say we look at the distribution of profit margins, and we look at the 10th percentile, the median, and the 90th, and put those. And what you find is that it's very significant, this fact that it's higher actually at the median. So it's the median firm that is more profitable in these investigated industries. And it's actually not the ones at the top. So when in the investigated industries, there's kind of profits in there. They're democratically shared, So it's not this idea that there's one firm kind of making a huge margin. It's actually shared among everybody. Okay?
I think that's the last outcome. There's this literature which use industrial data and they find market power and they control for increasing returns and things like that. I don't remember the paper. There are guys from Europe. It's very famous.
De Locker.
Exactly.
Yes.
I think they have a similar result.
Okay.
Or maybe
So to me, I think from an IO perspective, this is kind of what you would expect. Because if you're fixing prices in an industry, that should be shared by all the firms, right? It's not like everybody has the same price. You can have differentiation, but it's not clear that the profits should accrue only to one person. And again, remember I showed you the wages going down. So the wage is going down, that's a source of profits. And we don't observe prices, but I told you sales were going down. That's consistent, of course, with prices being higher. Okay? So this is just like I've put these in a chart to show you. So the green is when you're found not guilty, so the case is closed. The orange is what happens when you are guilty. So sales fall by a lot. With sanctions, they fall by less. The wage is falling a little bit. Here it's actually increasing. So that's a big change for workers. And then for profits, again, it looks like they're significantly higher, and then maybe falling a little bit. So, okay. So assume for a second this is causal. I haven't convinced you of that yet, but assume. So what do I interpret from this? Sanctions are benefiting consumers. So sales are going up, right? That's consistent with prices falling and moving down the demand curve, buying more. So consumers are benefiting, and workers are benefiting. Employment is going up, wages are going up. Now, this also says that COFECE is using its investigative resources efficiently. It's targeting industries where sales are falling, wages are falling, but profit margins are rising. Now, I don't know what's causing that, but that is consistent with a cartel restricting supply, restricting production in order to raise the margin. So, it's not that COFECE is investigating growing industries, right? It's also not the case that it's just investigating declining industries, because they're declining industries but where profits are going up, right? So it's pretty, you could just say, well, COFECE is just gonna, go after the declining industries and try to something like that. But no, it's his places where profit margins are rising. So I say one, COFECE is doing a good job. They're like looking in the right place. They have lots of places they could investigate. They have very few staff. They're looking in the right place. But, and this is sort of an additional claim, is that we cannot reject false negatives. So, and what is a false negative? That's where there's illegal conduct, but it's not sanctioned. Now, why do I claim that? Because if the closed cases, so suppose, just I found nothing there, that would be consistent with COFECE saying, okay, we only sanction the cases where bad things are happening. And so in the ones where we close the case, there's just no trend in the industry, right? Or, it could be that when we close the cases, yes, sales are falling and wages are falling, but profits are also falling. But because profits are still rising, when I close the case, it suggests to me that maybe something is going on. And so, I think from that basis, I take the claim that, well, COFECE, if they had more resources, more detectives, more budget, maybe they could identify things that are going on. And I think, part of this is, it's very hard to convict somebody, right? So you need a written evidence that they fixed prices or something. So it's not trivial to find that, and it requires a lot of resources. So, so that's my kind of policy message. Give them more budget. Now, I didn't convince you this was causal yet. So suppose the following, so we already know we're investigating declining industries. Maybe the commission takes pity on the industries that are doing really badly. And they say, well, you're declining, you can't even afford this fine if I sanction you. So maybe what they're doing is they're saying, we're going to sanction the industries which, within the set that I've investigated, are doing a bit better. And so that's all I'm picking up, okay? It's a spurious correlation. So here's my solution, and this is where you really have to tell me if you believe me or not. In Mexican law, there are two types of practices that are recognized, and the extent to which the judges, the panel of commissioners, has discretion varies between those. So in the first set of these absolute monopolistic practices, the judge actually doesn't have discretion. So if the investigators find a letter where you said we're going to fix prices, they have to sanction you. They can't choose not to. And this is in the US literature, this is called per se illegal. So actually, Mexican law is a little bit more specific than in the US, in that it actually says, here are the types of things, price fixing, segmentation, where the judges don't have discretion. In the US, there is a case law with the Supreme Court has basically agreed the same idea, but it's not written down. Okay, so that was the real estate broker example. Now, there's another class of practices which are called relative monopolistic practices. And those are subject to what in the US is called the rule of reason. So this is like something where, like an exclusive contract, where the defendant has the opportunity to argue that this is not actually bad and it's benefiting consumers. So I think a classic example would be Coca-Cola says to OXXO, you can only sell Coca-Cola. Now that maybe restricts sales of Pepsi, but because it has extra margin on that, Coca-Cola then gives them a free refrigerator or free advertising. So this is kind of a classic example, of where that might be valuable. And the law leaves open, that could be the case. So we don't want to punish every exclusive contract, but we want to give people a chance to argue. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to test what is the effect of sanctions in the absolute monopolistic practices and in the relative. And I claim that if we find effects in the absolute, it can't be the case that the judges are using their discretion. It's sort of just based on the evidence that they have. So for that reason, I think we can argue that it is causal, okay? So here I'll show you the results. So I've just interacted the sanction with a dummy for absolute monopolistic practices. These are the three variables. And indeed, what we find is that the sanction effect is driven by the cases with absolute monopolistic practices. So when you close the case, the industries are declining by a lot more. And when you sanction, the effect of sanction is a lot bigger. Whereas it's actually not significant in the relative cases. So if you told me, you said, well, Tristan, this is just happening because the judges are being lenient, that's actually not possible because the law prohibits them from doing that. It's just the evidence that they had available.
I would claim so.
Okay.
Isn't that the same case for relative monopoly practices when you restrict the analysis, relative monopoly practices?
So the effect of...
Did you run the same analysis, but just with the cases of monopolization or relative monopoly practices?
Yeah, so that's reflected here. So this constant without the dummy, that's relative monopolistic. Yeah, and then that's the effect of sanctions in relative. So we see that in the relative ones, the industries are still declining, but there's not this bump from the sanctions. Whereas in the cases of the absolute, there is this jump. Okay, and sorry. Oh wait. And so, you see a similar pattern. It's not as significant, but you can see the numbers are moving around in the same way. So it seems like these effects, yeah.
If you added the coefficients, which would be the coefficient of the absolute monopolistic practice, right? The financial sanction
Yeah.
plus the impact returns, and there would be significant.
These two, yeah, you might be right. Actually, I should add that. It helps me. Yes, that's actually a very good point.
In this case, you're not taking into account the non-sanction. You're just comparing monopolistic absolute versus relative monopoly.
No, I compare all four of them. So there's four groups, right? There's absolute and relative, and then sanction, no sanction. So this constant gives you no sanction relative. And then to get no sanction absolute, you add these two. And then to get the effect of sanction in relative is here. And then the effect of sanction, as you said, in absolute is the sum of these two. And it's a very good point that I can get a little more significance, yeah. And again, the profit margin is noisier, but this effect on sales and wages is quite clear. So this is coming from the absolute cases. So these effects are coming from the things where there's no discretion. And in fact, we also find that the effects of sanctions are bigger in these absolute monopolistic cases. And when you close the case, the outcomes are worse. So it seems like in these absolute cases, the stakes are higher, let's say. And the commission actually focuses more on absolute monopolistic practices. So if you look at the source of the investigation, the ex officio ones where the agency chooses are mostly absolute cases, and the ones that come from the public, denuncia, are these relative cases. So I just want to say something a bit here that, there's a debate, so Lena Khan, right, is now the chair of the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. She's a lawyer, written a lot about this stuff. And she actually takes a pretty strong argument that in these relative monopolistic cases, like vertical control, exclusive dealing, we should actually reduce judges' discretion. So we shouldn't have arguments about, is this going to help people or not? We shouldn't pay industrial organization economists to present testimony. We should just make stuff illegal. And, a lot of people are opposed to that. But so I want to say a little bit about the external validity and whether this applies to her argument. And I do actually think there's a different context, right? So she's talking a lot about big tech in the US on the edge of the technology frontier, where if you have exclusive relationships, you can slow innovation and so forth. In this case, we're studying commerce and manufacturing. So I should have given you more examples, but it's like refrescos, tortillas, things like this. Which is not at the innovation frontier. Let's see. So, it may be the case that, she still has a point in tech, but at least in the kind of the general part of the economy that we're regulating in Mexico, it seems like these absolute price fixing cartels, absolute monopolistic practices are, sort of higher stakes. And so from this perspective, I think, the evidence suggests that the commission has kind of been correct to focus on these kind of traditional.
How many cases do you have in absolute, and how many do you have in relative?
I don't have the number off the top of my head. It's about half and half.
Half and half?
Yeah. So let me. So there were 261 investigations since the beginning. We look at 95. I have to cut for a few reasons. So one is that I need at least 2 census periods of a control to match the synthetic control. So a lot of the earliest cases are dropped. Similarly, ones that happen after 2018 are dropped. And then there are a number, the rest are ones where either the industry was too specific that I couldn't match it. So one, it was like the trucking of honey in some case, it's too specific to find. And then there are another set of industries where you can't find a nearby control. So like for the telecoms, for example, it's not clear what you compare it to in the same sector. So that's why we've restricted it. I do show, remember I did that event study, which doesn't rely on the control group. So you can add like 40 examples and it sort of doesn't change the results to add those if you don't. But I think people like the control group, so I'm focusing on that. Okay, so you know, the commission has been doing a good job. Now, this is where we get, you know, to the DeLocher point. You know, a lot of macroeconomists like to say now, oh, okay, competition is, you know, a problem with the economy. And actually, so Mexico, you know, I don't want to, you know, belabor this, but sort of since the reform, I guess, or liberalization starts in '82, you know, GDP per capita growth has been pretty slow, less than 1% a year. And one hypothesis is that that's actually due to a lack of competition in the economy. And actually, the World Bank has claimed this. So there was an op-ed by our managing director who said, you know, competition in Mexico is an issue. Now, I don't have as much evidence, but there are reasons. So, you know, this is a quote from John Hicks, very famous. He said, "What the best of all profits for a monopoly is a quiet life." So, you know, monopolies are contracting supply, they slow things down. Maybe this plays a role in explaining slow growth in Mexico. And here's another point that my co-author brought up. So, you know, organized crime in Mexico is significant. A way to measure that is the homicide rate. So I actually didn't know that, but it's like much higher relative to the United States. And, you know, the narco cartels could play a role in economic cartels. So my co-author tells this story from the town she grew up in, where she said the cartel comes and they say, if you want to do construction, you have to buy from our company. So there's a monopolist. They raise prices. Supply goes down, you employ fewer people. That's the same story. So, you know, people will often say, you know, Mexico's not a developing country, but, you know, non-high income countries may have competition issues. I think there's reason to say that in Mexico in particular, it could be a problem, and the organized crime could be part of it. So what I want to ask is, well, could COFECE play a role in accelerating growth in the economy? I've already showed you that it can increase wages and sales, but now I'm going to ask, well, what does it do for productivity? And so I'm just going to use, you know, I think we kind of now know how to estimate production functions. It's taken a while in empirical I/O, but we now know. And so we just do the kind of Ali Pecas, Ackerberg, Cave, Fraser thing. I'm going to estimate a production function and estimate TFP. The way I do this, I'm happy to talk more. This is like a whole literature, but I estimate a production function for each treated industry, and then for the controls sort of separately. So the parameter is different over time. And that takes like 3 days. So, not that it matters. So here are the results. So it does look like productivity is going up after sanctions. So it doesn't seem that, at least, so this is, again, I'm going to do these distributions. Here's the mean. It doesn't seem to be falling, but it does go up afterwards. So there seems to be some effect on productivity. This is kind of interesting. So I look at TFP. Again, this is the distribution of establishments. And it seems actually that the targeted industries are ones where productivity is lower at the bottom of the distribution. So there's kind of when people talk about like a big tail of unproductive firms, that's actually more prevalent in the investigated industries. And that's also reversed more by the sanctions. So it seems that, I mean, these are all big too, they're not as significant, but it seems that part of what the sanctions do is they kind of remove this lower tail of the productivity distribution. And I don't know if that's coming from incumbents innovating or exit. That's hard to measure, but we do see these effects. So, and this was what the World Bank cared a lot about. They wanted to know, does competition enforcement affect productivity? And so I'm saying, yes, it does. Okay? So let me conclude. I was worried I didn't have enough slides. I hope we can talk, I guess, if I have time left over. So antitrust sanctions benefit consumers and workers. I'll go a step further to say that means they reduce inequality. Why? because shareholders are the richest people. And so if we allocate, money to consumers and workers, that's good for inequality. But, the closed cases, they still look suspicious. We have these falling wages and rising profits. So I cannot reject that we're still missing cartels. We're not sanctioning people who are doing something potentially harmful. And so, my policy message, hire more investigators. Focus more on these absolute monopolistic practices. And maybe then, if you had more resources, you'd change this pattern and we just see that, profits are flat when I close the cases. And then finally, we see these effects on productivity, so the commission can claim that they play a role in economic growth. Now, how big that is depends on the scale of their operation, but it seems to be possible. So those are my conclusions. I'll say I am interested in looking at the merger review side of this. Mexico has very good price data, right? The time series is less long, it's shorter. So that's something, I'd be happy to talk about. We can use kind of the ideas of Quokka to investigate that. So that's my talk. Thank you. Gracias.
Tenemos alrededor de 10 minutos. Si tienen alguna pregunta del público.
Por favor.
Es interesante que it's very interesting that you are finding that the relative monopoly practices do have a different.
Yeah.
I will tell you as a commissioner that most of the commissioners will have no rule of reason. They will apply the law like per se.
Yeah.
And so I don't know why is this happening, but that's why I asked you how many cases do you have.
I'll get that.
But most of the cases in which they have sanctions, for example, let me tell you, taxis from the airport.
Yeah.
There was no rule of reason. They just applied, they violated the law. That's a relative monopoly.
Yeah.
And maybe you have that case in this.
I don't have that one because it's such a specific, you can only see taxis in all of Mexico City. It was hard, you couldn't identify the airport. Yeah.
But that's an example in which the commission just applied the law and said they violated the law like a monopoly.
Yeah.
So I still have some problems with that difference in.
Well, maybe that helps my argument though, because it says that they aren't using the discretion to determine the sanctions. It's just how much evidence. Yeah. Now, here's the real, the threat to mine is that if the agency, if the investigators don't work as hard in certain cases, that would be a problem for me. So if I say, okay, this industry is growing, I'm not going to look for evidence as much, and so then, but I don't think that's happening.
No, that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
What happens, there is another issue also, the sectors. It's not a random process. We do have a plan. For example, when we became commissioners, we drafted the plan for 5 years, and we put several important industries.
Yes.
To be investigated. And for example, other cases, they use some statistical evidence, which will help you, your argument.
Mhm.
In that case, will help your argument.
To target the investigations. Yeah. And that would explain that they found industries where maybe profit margins are increasing. What were the evidence, what did they look at? Oh.
Very bad evidence, but they were looking at producer price indexes and final consumer price indexes. And that's like, if they are diverging,
Yeah.
there's something going on in that.
So that's exactly what we found, right? That the profit margin was increasing in these industries. So it's consistent. I want to just go back to.
But in some other cases, and I will tell you an additional argument. People do
Yeah.
your standard of proof is far lower than when you're talking about airlines. Because if you're talking about chicken, that will affect the reputation of COFECE at a very large level. And so with chicken, the standard of proof that you're asking for
I see.
is very low. And with airlines, no, not a lot of people, and less people will fly now from airlines because they are quite the stupid airport.
Right.
But
So,
still,
yeah, I know about this airport. Yeah.
and so they don't care. I mean, COFECE,
I see.
But if we are talking about chickens and food,
Yeah. So that's one thing I can test is to say, are the food industries, is the effect different? That's a good note.
I wanted to comment to you is that there is this witness protection program which started
Yeah.
with us.
Yes.
And with the witness protection program, you may want to control for that.
Yeah, so that, so one thing we do, I didn't show it here, was that we look at, do the effects differ over time? And it was like maybe a little bit, but not too significant. So I don't, most of the cases, the modal case happens in 2008 in the sample. There was a lot of activity at that time. So yeah, but yes, that's right. The agency has gotten sort of more power over time. Far more. It can, and the fines it can levy are larger. I just wanted to say one thing. So in this case, in the decision note, they say, oh, well, you know, actually, one reason why we shouldn't sanction this is because the wedding industry is growing. So, and yet here we found something very different. So kind of looking at, you know, the evidence that's used may be different than what you see over a long period of time in the census. So
What year was that? 2002?
this is, the case is in 2004. And I did look, I didn't, you know, there's a little hand wavy, but like the population is getting older. So you think like, you know, this is diapers, this is weddings, this is, you know, second children. Yeah. So, more questions for graduate students? I don't know if you can.
Checking if your estimates are being driven by one industry in particular or by any one case, like by things.
No, so it's pretty it's pretty uniform. So you see the difference is spread across. I tried like you know, manufacturing versus services. It wasn't significant. So.
And geographically?
So is that most of the cases are national markets, and so you do look at the local ones, but there's not a big difference there. So. Graduate students, come on. Okay, gracias.